You know, it's one of the most powerful and mysterious parts of our society. The idea that we can pull 12 complete strangers out of their daily lives, stick them in a room, and give them a task that will literally change someone's life forever. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and really unpack what happens inside that jury box.
We have this phrase, right? A jury of your peers. But what does that actually mean? What are these 12 people bringing into that room with them? Their biases, their life experiences, their preconceptions. How does all of that shape the path to a verdict? That's the big question we're diving into. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the jury ideal, what it's supposed to be. Then we'll get into the messiness of the real world, like the publicity problem and who actually gets chosen to be on a jury. From there, we'll sneak inside the jury room itself, and finally, we'll talk about the very real human cost of doing this incredibly difficult job.
Okay, first things first. Let's lay the groundwork. What is the justice system even trying to achieve when it puts a jury together? It really comes down to two huge core ideas.
The first big idea is what's called representativeness. The thinking is that the jury should be a mini version of the community, a real cross-section of society. It's not about finding 12 people who are clones of the defendant, but about making sure the group is pulled together in a way that's genuinely honest and fair.
And then there's the second piece of the puzzle. And this one, well, this one's maybe even tougher. Impartiality. The perfect juror, in theory, is totally indifferent. They have zero preconceived notions. They're ready to judge the case based only on the evidence they see and hear in the courtroom, period.
Now, this is where it gets kind of wild, because our legal system is built on some absolutely massive assumptions about jurors. It basically expects them to be blank slates. It assumes they can sit through weeks of testimony without forming an opinion, remember every single tiny detail, and perfectly wall off what they hear in court from everything else they know about the world.
So you have to ask, right? Are we asking for the impossible here? Can any actual human being live up to that kind of standard? This is the exact point where the beautiful ideal of the jury starts to collide with a much, much messier reality. And that collision with reality, it brings us right to our next big challenge. One of the biggest threats to that blank slate ideal is pre-trial publicity. I mean, in an age of 24/7 news cycles and social media, the walls of the courtroom are more like Swiss cheese than solid stone.
Just think about a huge, high-profile case, like the trial of singer Jacob Hoggart. Potential jurors are swimming in information or misinformation long before they ever step into court. They might hear about confessions or someone's past criminal record, all things that might be completely banned from being mentioned during the actual trial. The court of public opinion starts way, way before the real one.
And hey, this isn't just a hunch. We've got the data to prove it. A massive analysis of multiple studies found that when potential jurors are exposed to negative press about a defendant, they are significantly more likely to vote guilty. The effect is real, it's powerful, and it's measurable.
So what does the system do about it? Well, the go-to solution is often just a simple instruction from the judge. They'll say something like, the jury will disregard those remarks. Jurors are just told to, forget a piece of information they just heard.
But here's the thing. Our brains, they don't really work that way. It's the classic, don't think of a white bear problem. The second I tell you not to think about a white bear, what are you picturing? Right. Psychologists call it ironic process theory. The very act of trying to push a thought away just makes it stronger. So that judge's instruction, it can totally backfire, searing that forbidden information right into a juror's memory.
Okay, so we've seen how stuff from the outside world can leak into the courtroom. But what about the things jurors are already carrying with them? Let's talk about who actually ends up in that jury box and the psychology they bring to the table.
So remember that ideal of the jury being a perfect mirror of the community? Well, in the real world, it's a lot more complicated. The law basically says the government can't intentionally leave specific groups out, but that doesn't mean you automatically get a perfect cross-section. And in fact, major studies, like the Iacobbucci report, have found serious systemic problems, showing that First Nations peoples, for example, are consistently underrepresented on juries in Canada.
And it goes even deeper than demographics. It turns out that a juror's personality can actually predict how they might lean. Studies have shown that people with more authoritarian personalities, folks who are very rule-oriented, tend to side with the prosecution. On the other hand, you have rational processors who focus on logic and are less biased. And then there are experiential processors who are guided more by emotion and can be swayed by things that have nothing to do with the evidence, like how attractive a defendant is.
All right, the jury is selected.
They've heard all the evidence, and now we get to the most secret, most intense part of the whole process, deliberation. Let's try to peek inside that black box and see how a verdict actually gets made.
So how do 12 people make sense of everything they've heard? Well, it's not like a math equation where they assign points to each piece of evidence. Nope. The research overwhelmingly shows that jurors use what's called the story model. They are active storytellers. They take all the bits and pieces of evidence and weave them into a story that makes sense. And in the end, the most believable, most coherent story usually wins.
And how they build that story depends a lot on their deliberation style. Some juries are evidence-driven. They talk through all the evidence first, really dig in, and only vote at the end. But other juries are verdict-driven. They take a vote right at the start. And get this, it is absolutely shocking. When a jury does that, the result of that very first poll predicts the final verdict 90% of the time. The deliberation then just becomes about people defending their initial position, not working together to find the truth.
So that brings up a really important question. When do all these other things, the biases, the publicity, the personality traits, when do they have the most impact? Well, psychologists have a theory for this. It's called the liberation hypothesis. And it says that when the evidence is unclear, ambiguous, or just a really close call, jurors feel liberated from the facts. That's when they're most likely to fall back on their gut feelings, their personal biases, and stereotypes to make the final call.
We've spent all this time talking about how jurors affect a verdict. But for this last section, I want to flip the script completely. Let's talk about how the verdict and the whole trial affects the jurors.
The thing is, serving on a jury, especially for a really disturbing case with graphic evidence, it's not just a civic duty. It can be a profoundly traumatic event. Jurors can walk away with serious anxiety, stress, and even full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder.
This trauma comes from being exposed to horrible facts and images. It's called vicarious trauma, and from the incredible stress of knowing your decision will change someone's life forever. And what made it even worse is that for the longest time, Canadian law flat out forbade jurors from ever talking about their deliberations with anyone. That meant they couldn't even process it with a therapist. A juror support program was finally started in 2017, but it just goes to show what an incredible burden we place on these citizens.
And that leaves us with one last big thought. We rely on 12 ordinary people to be these perfect, impartial, resilient judges in the face of incredible pressure and sometimes real trauma. We ask them to pass judgment. But when you look at the huge gap between the ideal and the reality, maybe we also need to ask ourselves, how do we judge a system that asks so much